Hello, I'm Lugatorix and welcome to my Milan faction guide for Medieval 2 Total War. Today we're going to be discussing the faction of Milan in the Grand Campaign, its units and some strategy. So, let's get straight into it. Milan is an Italian faction, it's a Catholic faction based in the north of Italy. And it's this green region right here. They start off with 2 settlements, and the interesting thing with Milan is there is quite a few potential enemies. I mean, they really are quite in the thick of it. You've got France as a potential enemy, the Holy Roman Empire, and probably more concerningly actually, the other Italian factions. Venice, Sicily maybe, and the Papal States. So, quite a few factions around you, which is, you know, it can be a difficulty, but it's certainly a fun challenge nonetheless. Now, their strengths are they boast strong militia, infantry, crossbowmen, and late technology, but their weakness is poor offensive cavalry, so they're not a particularly cavalry-based faction. The campaign rules for the long campaign, or the grand campaign, is to hold 45 regions, including the Constantinople region. So that's interesting. Quite a few of the factions, it's Jerusalem you have to hold. For these guys, it's Constantinople. So you're probably going to be expanding this direction at some point, but we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. What I'm going to do first of all is talk through the units, and I'll see you in a second. So these are the Milanese units, and they're in a lovely green colour, one of the more vibrant colours of Medieval 2 Total War, I'd say. And they look a bit like the Brutii in Rome, but that's completely irrelevant, so let's stop. So we'll start off with the peasants, like we always do. And like I always say, peasants are pretty useless. There'll be some circumstances where maybe you'll want them to lower the population of a settlement, or you just need them as garrison in a pretty useless settlement, but in general, peasants cannot be relied upon in battle because they're poor morale and just generally poor stats. And I don't think really anyone seriously thinks that peasants are good in battle. Then we go on to the Italian militia, and this is one of the strengths of the Italian faction, is their particularly early game militia units are better, significantly better actually, than some of the other militia units of the early game. So these Italian militia have a 7 attack and 9 defense. Now that's pretty decent stats for what is essentially a basic militia unit. That's pretty solid stats indeed. And what that means is you can assert your dominance over weaker factions by virtue of the fact that your spearmen or militia units are just simply superior. And that's a pretty cool thing indeed. So particularly in the early game, you have a comparative advantage over other people, and you should take advantage of that if you're good. Now we go on to the pike militia. Now pike militia is interesting. I've always found pike militia interesting because their defense is 1, but they do have very long spears and can form a spear wall, which is kind of similar to the Rome Total War phalanx kind of thing. So in a sense, that defense of 1 is a little bit illusory. It's a little bit harsh because actually it's quite physically hard to get to these guys if they set up in a good defensive position. If you charge cavalry into them, they're going to have a tough old time because an attack of 7 is not terrible, but also the cavalry is going to find it physically hard to get to the men, and it just means they're going to die. But a defense of 1 means a charge into the back or the side of these guys and they are gone. So an interesting unit. Personally, I wouldn't want to rely on a unit that has a defense of 1, especially when you have Italian militia, which are actually pretty solid. Now we'll go on to the Sergeant Spearmen, and these are trained and hardened warriors protected by a large shield, armed with spears and able to form a defensive ring of spears. A little bit of repetition there, but attack of 7, defense of 9 is exactly the same as the Italian militia, but these guys can form a schiltron, which is a special formation, and of course they have a bonus fighting cavalry because they're spearmen. Again, a pretty solid spear unit for the early game, definitely. Then we get on to Italian spear militia. You see how there's a lot of spearmen? Yeah, that's the strength of Milan basically. These guys have 7 attack but an improved defense of 13, and they can also form the schiltron. So they are definitely a step up, the Italian spear militia, from the Italian militia. It's very easy to get confused by these guys, but I mean these guys have slightly better armor, you can just see in the picture, but very easy to get confused. But these guys, the high defense ones, are better of course, because if you have high defense you're more likely to survive in the long term, and that's a good thing for a battle. Now we move on to Armoured Sergeants, and again Armoured Sergeants are a pretty damn solid unit. 7 attack, 14 defense, so actually higher this time. They have a higher defense, and they're just quite hardy warriors. They've got a big old shield on them, so they're less likely to be attacked by arrows and stuff, and they're just hardy. They can stand longer in a battle, and again cavalry is going to have a tough time getting through these guys because that's their strength, particularly against cavalry. Then we have dismounted men-at-arms. Dismounted, these men are effective and well-protected infantry. Attack of 11, which I think is the highest we've seen so far, so a more offensive unit, but saying that, a defense of 21 is really quite good. Combat bonus in woods, well armoured, which you can see from the picture, and good stamina. I say this every time, but well armoured really does mean a lot in this game because it can give you a huge advantage over the enemy, purely because a lot of people in the early game will not have the technology to produce troops, particularly archers, that can actually penetrate armour. So if you have good armour, then you're very much invincible, to a certain extent in the early game, and then even as you go on, armour becomes a necessity because everyone else has got more improved technology. So having a well-armoured troop with a defense of 21, always a good thing, and that means that dismounted men-at-arms are always a good troop. Very solid infantry, again, from the Milanese faction. And then we move on to dismounted broken lances. Broken lances are well-trained and experienced professional soldiers, protected by plate mail, armed with swords. 11 attack, 22 defense, so 1 up from the previous unit. And again, well-armoured, good stamina. Good stamina, I'll talk about for a second, is a cool thing as well. Obviously, that means they're less likely to get tired. If a unit's tired, they're going to move slower, and also they're more likely to break. So the fact that these guys can move faster when they're have run for a while, and also the fact that they're less likely to break down due to tiredness, well, pretty good thing, I would say. Yeah. Then we move on to the dismounted feudal knights. Now these guys are 13 and 21 respectively, so slightly better on the old attack. Knights would often dismount and fight on foot when the situation demanded it. Dismounted, they make excellent heavy infantry, and that's how I describe them as well. And the main bonus of these guys, as opposed to these guys, is that they have good morale. So we've discussed how troops are less likely to break down if they're tired, but also if they have good morale, then they're even less likely to break down, and that's a really good thing. A harder unit like this, it's just going to be tough, and they're going to cut through stuff, which is just pretty awesome. So I do like the Milan infantry, really quite good stuff actually, and you have a big advantage over a lot of other factions, so take advantage of that. Then we're going to go on to the missile troops, and firstly, peasant crossbowmen. Now, peasant crossbowmen are quite interesting, because a 9 missile attack for the early game is good. It's because a lot of factions will be having these peasant archers for a while. 5 missile attack, so to have 9 is nearly double. That's quite good, and the crossbowmen are pretty decent anyway. They're obviously better than the peasant archers because they're like bolts or whatever you call them, are pretty hardy stuff. They're pretty good stuff. So obviously in the melee they're pretty trash. Attack of 2, defense of 1, but you're not going to be using these guys in the melee unless it's like, I don't know, a complete disaster, at which point you've probably lost the battle anyway if you have to rely on these guys in the melee. They're not melee troops, but in the missile they'll do a damn good job. And the peasant archers, weird they did it this way around, because these guys are actually a downgrade from the peasant crossbowmen, but fair enough game, you can do whatever you want I suppose. Very similar stuff in the sense that their melee is awful, so don't use them for the melee. Like I wouldn't recommend using normal peasants in the melee, but for a missile attack of 5 in the early game, if used effectively, on top of a wall or a high ground or whatever, they can do a pretty good job against unarmoured troops. So not too bad, but they're going to become redundant pretty quickly when you are able to recruit crossbowmen. Then we have the arquebusiers, and this is a unit which is very common amongst the European factions, like particularly the Mediterranean factions. Missile attack of 14 is a lot higher than what we've seen so far, but they're not ranged. They're not ranged like the crossbow or the archers. These guys are basically for morale damage. I've talked about these guys a lot before, so I'm not going to do it too much here, but they're basically for morale damage. The smoke and noise caused by the firearm going off at close range means that the morale is going to get a serious hit from the opposition, and that's going to mean they're easier to break down. Particularly the infantry is going to make them easy to break down. These guys are slightly better in the melee because they have to be, because they're going to be closer, physically closer to the enemy when firing their weapon. So they've got attack of 6. Then we go on to the musketeers, if I click properly. Pretty similar unit actually, but they're basically like a long-range version of what you just saw. So even better, because if you have a long-range version, then you don't have to worry so much about the melee, and you can still cause a good amount of morale damage, and in particular 14 missile damage is good. You're going to be causing damage, and that's a good thing always. Now we're going to get on to the Genoese crossbow militia. Yes, now they're damn cool. Superior Italian crossbow garrison unit armoured with a brigadine, I think I'm saying that right, and a pavese. So they have 6 attack, which is the same as the previous 2 units, and a missile attack of 12, which is pretty solid for a long-range troop anyway. But their defense of 15 means they are just absolutely not in any way a liability. And what you'll find is, often with missile troops, is ironically, they're actually vulnerable to missiles themselves. The very thing that makes them good is also their weakness. If you look, for example, at peasant archers, vulnerable to missiles. These guys, vulnerable to missiles. They're not going to be vulnerable to missiles because look at that thick-ass shield they've got. Yeah, they've got a big-ass shield on them, and that means they can block those arrows every time that they come at them. So, a really solid unit, not a liability. If they do, for some reason, get caught in the melee, it's not a disaster because they've got a big shield and 15 defense. I mean, this is about as good as it gets in terms of crossbowmen in the melee. You know, nearly about as good as it gets. I like these guys. Then we get on to Genoese crossbowmen, pretty similar, but they actually have a higher attack. And was it a higher defense as well? Yeah, it is a higher defense. Higher attack and defense and missile attack. They're basically a slightly boosted version of what you just saw. So, as you can tell, I like them. And then finally, we get on to handgunners. Earliest handheld firearm unit. Causes more fear than actual damage. These soldiers need to be capable in close combat due to the short range of their weapons. Very similar to the arquebusiers, but basically a better version. They've got a similar missile attack, but they're actually better in the melee, so they're just better versions. There's a more amplified version of the arquebusiers. Pretty good. I mean, I personally prefer the crossbows because they're long range to these sort of short range handgun things. And also when you've got these guys, the musketeers that can fire long range, I don't personally see a huge amount of need for the handgunners, but some people probably would like them. It's just not my thing personally. And then we're going to get onto the cavalry. And we're going to start off with mounted sergeants. These veteran warriors wear light armour and are armed with a spear and a sword. 9 attack, 13 defense. Not bad for early period cavalry. That's pretty standard. Maybe slightly better than average, but it's pretty standard stats for early period cavalry. They'll do a job in the early game. They're alright at running troops down, but I mean, obviously in the later game, when you're facing armoured troops and so on and so forth, they're going to become redundant. But in the early game, they'll do a pretty solid job, absolutely, for a while. And then we'll move on to the cavalry militia. Now, these guys are better because they've got 15 defense, and 15 defense for cavalry, particularly in the early to mid game, is very, very solid indeed. Encased in mail and equipped with lances and swords, these troops are effective fighters. And it's the fact they're encased in mail, which means they're better at defense. They're less likely to be hurt by arrows, and they're just going to last longer. Now, generally, cavalry in Medieval 2 Total War, you want to use them as shock cavalry. You want to get that good charge in. You don't particularly want to be in a long slugging match, but the fact that you have the flexibility to potentially fight for a long time in a long slugging match, it could be useful if you necessarily need it. So, the fact you've got 15 defense gives you that luxury if you want it. And we'll move on to the men-at-arms. If you remember, earlier we had the dismounted men-at-arms. Well, these are the mounted version. Well-equipped heavy cavalry with plate armour and a lance. So they've got plate armour, which is even more badass. And you can just see, because they look more badass, they've got a cool helmet. So, that's cool. 8, 15 and a 7 charge bonus. Well-armoured. Good unit of cavalry. Then we get on to mailed knights. Now, these are encased in mail, as you could imagine, and they are formidable fighting machines, the game says. Attack of 10, which is the highest we've seen so far. 14 defense is pretty good as well, but good morale. And I always say, any unit with good morale is a solid unit in my eyes, particularly cavalry. It's rare for cavalry to have good morale, and that means even more so they can be, after they've charged, they can stand up for longer. Because of that, they're going to be less vulnerable to spearmen, and so on and so forth. They're going to stand, or trot, whatever, and fight, and that's what you want your cavalry to do. Pretty solid stuff. The charge could be a little bit higher for my liking, but I still quite like them. Then we get on to feudal knights. Now, feudal knights are, well, they're heavy geezers. They're heavy armor. They're armed with a lance. They're elite warriors, and they ride down their opponents. 10 attack, 16 defense, which I think is the highest we've seen so far. Yeah, I think so. They may charge out orders, which can be annoying. But if you know this game, honestly, I find the cavalry flipping charges without orders anyway at the best of times. So that doesn't affect me too much. I just find everyone, the units just do what they want. If I was in the game and I was a faction leader or a general, I'd have no authority. I just wouldn't, because they never do what I ask them to do. So honestly, the fact that feudal knights may charge out orders means, well, they're going to charge out orders anyway, probably. So you might as well just go along and enjoy the ride. Then we have broken lances. Now, not quite as amazing in the old attack and defense, but the good thing about these broken lances is they have a powerful charge. A charge of 8, which I again believe is the highest we've seen so far. And like I said, The cavalry in this game, for me, I personally like to use them as sort of shock cavalry with a big old charge in the side or the back to break units. That's why I like using cavalry for in Medieval 2, and this is like the perfect, or one of the perfect units to do that, you know, because they've got that good charge bonus. They're not going to be amazing in a long old fight, although they do have good morale, so that's something to take into consideration. But they are more as a sort of one-time, big old long charge, lances down, bang, into the back of infantry, and they're going to be rousing pretty quickly because they don't like being charged by the broken lances. Then the General's Bodyguard. Now obviously the General's Bodyguard's got to be good, and a 13 and 16 attack and defense respectively is pretty solid. Hit points are 2, good morale, very good stamina, which is cool for cavalry. Stamina is probably more important for cavalry because they're going to be doing more running during the course of a battle. Well armoured, obviously they're going to be good because they need to protect the General. And then we get on to the more advanced variant of the General's Bodyguard, which is basically, I think the only difference is a slightly higher defense, and also the horse looks more badass, so, you know, like, why wouldn't you want that? And we have even more cavalry, believe it or not. We have Knights Hospitalier, which is cavalry, which is available for other factions as well. 13 and 16 and 8. Very solid stats. I don't want to keep repeating myself, but very, very solid stats indeed. Well armoured, good morale. And as I always say in all these videos, they are fighting for Christendom. They are fighting for their religion, their faith. And any unit that does that means they're just going to fight that a little bit harder, and they're generally a pretty solid unit. They're less likely to break because they have the cause of religion on their side. So, you know, any unit that's fighting for their religion is pretty solid in the game. And then we have the, oh, this is going to test my Italian. If you didn't know, I am a small amount, I'm part Italian. I do have some Italian family. So let's see if I can pronounce this right. Famiglia Ducale. Famiglia Ducale? Yes, I think that is right. Okay, I think that's right, which probably means family. I have no idea what Ducale means. So, I don't know, whatever. Armoured in plate and wielding lances, these elite knights defend the Duke's honour. Could you just not tell us what Famiglia Ducale means? Familia, that must mean family, right? I mean, who cares? 13, 14 and 8. Good morale, powerful charge. They would be a pretty awesome cavalry unit if I knew what they meant, but sadly I don't. Despite having Italian family, what would they think of me, hey? And then we're going to finally move on to the last melee cavalry unit, which is the Knights Templar, 13, 16 and 8. I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but they are elite and some say reckless knights formed to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. So they're protecting pilgrims, they're going to fight hard. That's basically what it means. And then we're going to get on to mounted crossbowmen, the only missile cavalry that is seemingly available to the Milanese. They have a missile attack of 5, which isn't particularly amazing for crossbowmen, but they're on a horse, so they're like badass, and they're fast moving. So, you know, you have to take that into consideration. They are more effective than just 5. They are more effective than a unit of peasant archers because they're going to cause havoc. They can skirmish much more effectively, and they're just going to be less likely to be caught because they can be quite annoying in that respect. Now, if you want to have a look at the... I was going to say, normally I say at this point, if you want to have a look at the siege equipment, go to my England faction guide. But I believe this is a new one for the Italian faction, so I will talk about this one. But I'm not going to talk about these ones, like the ballista and all that, because if you want to go and see that, go to my England faction guide. It's the same for all factions, and I don't want to repeat myself every time. But this looks different to me. So, Crocchio Standard... That's a weird mix of Italian and very English. Okay, cool. Wagon bearing Milan standard to inspire the army, pushed by elite troops armed with spears and light armour. Is this? I think this is just a thing for the Milanese, but either way, they definitely have these. 12 attack, 16 defense. But the cool thing about these, I mean, the attack and defense isn't that. That's not what you're going to be worrying about. It's the morale bonus that is the cool thing about these guys. And anything that adds morale is worth it for me. And then finally we're going to have a look at the mercenaries, so the religious fanatics, a motley assortment of zealots and manics from amongst the common folk of Europe, travelling to the Holy Land. Now this is another interesting unit because 13 attack is pretty solid, 1 defense isn't, but they have good morale, and they're just crazy. They're just crazy. They just chop through anything, but because they're fighting for their religion, like I keep saying. So it's tough to know whether to use these units, but in the right situation they can be very, very useful. But if you're just going to charge them into a bunch of archers that are firing missiles at a rapid rate, then they're just going to be screwed. So use these guys effectively and sparingly, and they can do a very good job turn the tide of a battle in your favour, in the name of God, of course. So now we're going to have a look at the campaign map, and I will talk some strategy for the faction of Milan. And here we are. So Milan start off with 2 settlements, like I said. What I'm going to do, by the way, I'm going to turn off the fog of war very quickly. I don't ever play with the fog of war off, but just so you can see what's going on, it makes it a lot easier for me to explain if you can actually physically see. So there we go. You can see what's going on. So we start off with 2 settlements. It is Milan and Genoa in the north of Italy. And yeah, you can see there is quite a few places that could be attacking you. So what would I do early on? Well, first of all, because you don't want to spot all-out European war straight away until you're ready, go for the rebel factions. That, you know, particularly Florence, because Florence is going to be the target of the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, and yourself. So you need to make sure you're the first ones to get it. It's a cool place because it's on the coast. You've got, you know, fishing and whatever this is, textiles. And it's just a cool place for economy. And you don't want to get your other factions to have a head start on you. Make sure you get it. It's a relatively well-defended region naturally defended because of the mountains. And Florence itself, not got a lot of amazing troops in. Italian militia, decent. Italian spear militia, decent. Crossbowmen, decent. But rubbish walls is only a palisade. And also, it's only 4 units. So if you send a decent-sized army to Florence, you should be guaranteed to take it. And then you've got a good start already. You've got a settlement before your other competitive factions are doing it. Potential enemies are doing it. So that's cool. Another faction I'd probably go for, settlement I'd probably go for, is maybe Bern if you were going to expand this direction. Now, it's nice to have it Bern, or in fact, I wouldn't go for Dijon, it's too overexposed. It's nice to have Bern because at some point you're going to want a faction to attack you. You don't want to get excommunicated, so you want to bait other factions into attacking you. If you take Bern, then the Holy Roman Empire or France is relatively likely to attack you at some point, not straight away, but at some point, and then it's your prerogative, it's your right, damn it, to go forward and just absolutely annihilate them, and excommunication won't be too much of an issue if they attack you first. If you attack the Holy Roman Empire first, because they've taken Bern and you want it, but you've been too slow to take it, then the Pope is going to screw you over, call a crusade probably, and then everyone's going to absolutely dogpile you from every angle. You're done for. So I would personally go for Bern if you're feeling ambitious, and yeah, that's the way to play this game, is ambitious in my opinion. So Bern is a nice one, but 2 I would definitely go for is Ajaccio and Cagliari. And I said this in my last faction guide, which was Sicily. It can be annoying because the Moors will try and take them off of you like every 2 minutes, but it's worth it. 2 islands, so you've got a lot of trade going on, and also you don't want the other factions taking control of the seas, you don't want the other factions taking control of the economy, and you just don't want your other factions to get big. If you've got rebel settlements, they're just free settlements basically. They're free settlements for you to take. You're not going to get excommunicated because of them, and you're just going to get more economy and all of that because of them. So it's a no-brainer. I would go for these 2 personally. Is this Sardinia and Corsica? I think that's my geography, right? I would go for them, even though it can be annoying with the Moors, but or the Sicilians potentially as well. But just deal with it. It is worth it in my opinion. Yeah, I would say it's definitely worth it. If you want to hear more detail about these 2 islands, watch my Sicilian faction guide, because I talked about it in more detail only the other day. So that's something for you to have a look at maybe. And then where'd you go on from there? Because you've taken a few rebel settlements. Where'd you go on for? Well, at the point where you've taken about 4 or 5 rebel settlements, what's going to happen is, well, first of all, I would go for an alliance. Try and take an alliance with someone. Now, probably either France or the Holy Roman Empire. Depends which one you want to go for first. I would probably go for the Holy Roman Empire. I'd probably go for an alliance with the HRE. And then at some point, everyone's going to have alliances with each other. Everyone's going to have an alliance with each other, and then eventually someone's going to break the alliance, and it's going to cause a massive European war. This happens so often in Medieval 2. It's going to cause a massive European war. France are probably going to attack you, and then you can be, like I said earlier, your prerogative. Just go forward and smash them up. Smash France up. But it's unpredictable. That might not happen. Maybe the Holy Roman Empire will attack you. So where to go after the rebel settlements? Well, after you've got your alliance, whoever you're deciding to ally with, which I would, because you don't want to be attacked too early on. You want to get the rebel settlements without pressure from the outside. Once you get your alliance, somebody's going to attack you at some point. And at that point, go ham on them. But I can't say this faction is going to attack you, so you go that way. You've got to think, okay, you've got to be responsive to the situation around you. But if a faction attacks you, then take advantage of it, man. That's what I would do. That's personally what I would do. Take advantage. But for God's sake, I just wouldn't. Don't just go and think, oh, well, nobody's attacked me yet. It's the 5th turn. I'm just going to go and take Marseille. Because everyone will hate you instantly, and that's not the start you want to get to the battle. On the campaign. I would want to be friends with the Pope and only annoy him if it means taking settlements off a faction that's attacked you, meaning you're less likely to get excommunicated. I hope I wasn't rambling too much there, and that kind of makes sense. But basic advice is, take the rebel settlements, Florence, Ajaccio, Corsica, and Bern probably as well. Form an alliance with someone, one of the big European powers, preferably not the Italian states, because war with them is inevitable. And then take advantage of that alliance, or these series of alliances. Whoever attacks you and goes to war with you, take advantage of them. The reason I would choose France to go to war with rather than the Holy Roman Empire is because they have more access to the sea, meaning they have a better economy, whereas this area, not a lot of sea trade going on. That's my personal opinion, but it is totally up to you. Also, the settlements are more spread out, so France is going to take longer, and it's going to be more difficult for them to get reinforcements over to, let's say, Marseille if you take it, than let's say if you took Staufen. Innsbruck's pretty close, Frankfurt's pretty close, Nuremberg's pretty close. Get what I'm saying? So, I'm going to stop rambling now and end the episode, but Milan is a very, very cool faction. I'd actually say it's one of the more fun factions in the game to play as, and I think they're pretty cool. So, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you around.